So this is not at all what is usual for my usual videos. Usually I post gaming content, but I felt like this would be fun to do. So this is a band album tier list. And what that is essentially is I'm going to be reviewing a band that I like, and I'm going to be reviewing all of their official albums, and I'm going to be ranking them from the best from the worst. And I'm going to try the best I can to stay in order because there's a lot of albums here. And if you haven't guessed already, this is a Napalm Death album rank tier list. So from here on, we're going to start from the very first album, and then we're going to end with the very most recent album. And we're just going to stick with a standard S, A, B, C, D. I think that works. As a matter of fact, we're going to delete that row. We're just going to keep it simple. So we're going to start with Napalm Death's very first album, Scum, and that is an obvious A. And for the reason being, it's the album that started the entire grindcore genre. It's the album that inspired me to pick up a guitar and to get into music. Looking back now from a more mature standpoint, the production quality wasn't really the greatest, especially on the B-side, because there's two sides to this album. There's the A-side and the B-side. Both sides are incredibly different from one another, and that is simply because there is two completely different lineups. Because a very interesting fact about Napalm Death is that there is no original members in the band, and technically there's only the A side of Scum features the original member, which is the last original member, which is Nicholas Bolin. He was the bassist, and he also sang on vocals. But during halfway through the album's production, he left. So the drummer, Mick Harris, took over the reins of the band after Nicholas Bolin and A-side guitarist Justin Broderick, who is the guitarist for Godflesh, who went on to play drums for Head of David. So Nicholas Bolin lost interest and left the band in somewhere in 1986. So Mick Harris, the drummer, carried on the project. At this point, there's absolutely no original members in Napalm Death, and Mick Harris, Jimmy Whiteley, Lee Dorian, and Bill Steer take up as the lineup for Scum. And like I said before, there are no members of Scum left on them today. Every single person who performed on this album has left the band at some point, which is really weird to think about, but other than that, this is the album that started the entire grindcore genre, so it's obviously A tier. So actually, you know what, I'm gonna go a little bit further. So the A-side is definitely a lot better when it comes to production. The A-side is produced in E-flat tuning, and The production's a lot cleaner. The tone is a lot more coherent. You can hear the riffs a lot more. You can kind of sort of understand what the vocalist Nick Bolan is trying to say. He's actually trying to articulate, even though that he's screaming, which is very uncommon for a lot of metal. Which the A-side proves to be a lot more punk, which Napalm Death is very punk-rooted. But it's definitely a lot better than the B-side. So the B-side, I really respect what Mick Harris did with carrying on the project, but he was just the drummer. He wrote a lot of the guitar parts for the B-side, and the recordings are in C standard tuning, and they're, as a 4-piece, they're a lot looser sounding, a lot sloppier, a lot dirty. It's not great. The A side is definitely a lot better. The songs are definitely a lot more structured. The B side is definitely a lot more heavy metal, while the A side is a lot more punk sounding. And that's just due to the different lineups. So if I had to rank it out of 10, I would say it's a solid 7, because it's honestly overall a mess of an album, but I think it deserves to be in the A tier because it's what started it all. Okay, I rambled on way too much about that. The second album, From Enslavement to Obliteration. This is going to go in the A tier as well, because this is just personal bias. This also is the album I listened to right after Scum. I listened to Scum. This was a current period where Napalm Death was a lot more structured. They definitely figured out what they were doing. At this point, Jimmy Whiteley, who performed on bass on the B-side of Scum, he left, and Shane Embury was joined on bass, who is currently the longest tenured member of Napalm Death. He was offered in the past to join Napalm, but he declined. But he joined in 1988 to perform Napalm Death's From Enslavement to Obliteration. So this album was definitely a lot more concrete in their style. The production quality, I'm going to be very honest, is not great. It was recorded in, I think, less than a week, and it was recorded very cheaply. The drums are a little washy and overbearing. Like, it's very washed out sounding, but also like it's very incredibly loud. The bass is hardly audible. The guitars, the mids are scooped, so it's just all bass, and you can't really hear them that well. And Lee Dorian, who was a very, very raw vocalist and has a very brutal sound, he doesn't really make on both the B-side and this record, From Enslavement to Obliteration, he doesn't really make a whole lot of effort into pronouncing the lyrics, which I think is a downside, because it just sounds like he's just screaming nonsense, which I understand, like, metal is supposed to be like deep and growl and heavy, but like you can clearly tell like he's not even trying to pronounce what's being written. But regardless, this album heavily influenced me. This entire album is in C, I want to say either C sharp or either C sharp standard. There's a lot of really good songs on here, like Think for a Minute and Cock Rock and Alienation. Those are really good albums. Until Unchallenged Hate, that took a while. That's a really catchy tune. But other than that, it goes in the A tier. It had a heavy influence on me, and that's the only reason why it goes in the A tier. If I wasn't biased, I'd probably put it in the B or C tier. But with other that being said, we're gonna be moving on. And the third album is Harmony Corruption. So we're gonna put it in the B tier, and I'm gonna explain why in a second. So at this point, Lee Dorian and Bill Steer have left the band because of musical differences. Bill Steer left to focus on Carcass, and Lee Dorian left just because he wanted to pursue a more different music taste, which he went to pursue a band called Cathedral. He formed a band called Cathedral that's more of a doom metal band, very opposite of what he was doing in Napalm Death. Cathedral is a doom metal band, which is very slow sounding metal music, versus Napalm Death, which is very fast. And this would be a completely new lineup with Mick Harris, Shane Embury, Mitch Harris, Jesse Pintado, and Barney Greenway, which is the vocalist, with Jesse and Mitch being the guitarist. And this will be their solo death metal album. This was really their only true death metal album. They recorded this in Morrisound Studios in Florida, with Chris Barnes as being their producer. So this album was very, I'm not gonna lie, I appreciate it for what it is now, but I'm not really going crazy over it. I only give it a lot of respects because this is actually the last album that Mick Harris, the drummer who carried on the project from Napalm Death, this is the last album he actually performed on before he left due to musical differences. Other than that, it's in the area of death metal in the early 90s. It's not much far off from what you would be hearing from Cannibal Corpse or Death or Morbid Angel. Like, it's very samey. There is a couple catchy tunes like Mind Snare and Unfit Earth. Those songs are really, really catchy. I like those songs. But other than that, nothing really stands out too much. I appreciate it for what it is. But other than that, it's not incredible. It's not blow your socks off like these two albums were. So, actually, you know what? I'm gonna put this at a C. I think for everything I said, I think this deserves to be in a C. So for Utopia Banished, which is their fourth album, I'm gonna put this at a B. This is their first album without Mick Harris. At this point in time, comparison to Scum, their first album, and this album, there's a completely new band. There is Barney Greenway on vocals, Shea Embry on bass, Jesse Pintado on guitars, Mitch Harris on guitars, not to be confused with Mick Harris, the drummer, and Danny Hara, the new drummer for the band. And Danny Hara is definitely a more classical drummer. He definitely knows a lot of, he has a more diverse range in techniques compared to Mick Harris. Mick Harris, in my opinion, he is not at all a bad drummer, but in my opinion, I think he is just, his style was just how hard he can hit the cymbal and how aggressive he can hit the cymbal. It wasn't really much how complicated the drums were, it's just how aggressive and how fast he can play. But Danny Hara is more of a complete drummer, and you can definitely hear the difference on this record. This record, in my opinion, is kind of like a death metal, grindcore kind of genre. There is a lot of catchy songs on this album. I think this is when Napalm Death had that second wave of getting a grip of what their identity was. And this album just really kicks ass. There's a lot of really catchy tunes, like I Abstain, like that's the starting album song of the album. That's probably one of the most catchiest ones because it's just such a hard-hitting song. There's really not a whole lot I can say about like complaining about this album. It's just, it took me a little while to warm up to, just because it didn't have Mick Harris on it, and I was a very classic Napalm Death person for a while, but I eventually warmed up to it, and it's a very solid Napalm Death record, so it's gonna stay in the B category. So next record is, what's the next record? Oh, okay. So this one, Fear, Emptiness, and Despair. This is their 5th record. Same lineup as the last record. This is also a fucking awesome record. This is the beginning of Napalm Death's more, I want to say, like, not experimental, like groovy, kinda. Like, there's a lot of groovy songs on this album. Twist the Knife Slowly, Plague Rages. Those are very, very groovy kind of songs. And this is the beginning of when Napalm Death started to become more label friendly, shall we say. They really, really tried to appeal to labels. And this is the beginning of Napalm Death kind of trying to become more radio friendly, more label friendly. The history behind this album is a lot of the band members today consider this to be their least favorite album, just because there's been such a strain between what the band wanted to do and what the label wanted to do. But it didn't stop the record from being really, really catchy, and I think it's a solid 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 B record. So moving on to their 6th album, Diatribes. Okay, this is going to be a very, very, very controversial take, but I absolutely love Diatribes. This is, for most people, considered Napalm Death's most polished, radio-friendly, label-friendly album. There's a lot of groove, a lot of alternative. The first track on this album, Greed Killing, that's very melodic. And then Let In by My Own Worst Enemy, that's really hard-hitting song. My favorite track off this record is Curse to Crawl. That is sang, partial vocals are by Shane Embry, the bass player. He also sings and plays bass on that track. Most people, for most Napalm Death fans, this is their least favorite album, but when I was a teenager, this was actually my 4th album I've ever listened to by Napalm Death, and for most people, it's considered polished garbage. But for me, I was blown away that Napalm, because I was so used to listening to these 2 albums, and then I went straight to listening to this album. I was blown away by the fact that Napalm Death could actually be that melodic, and it genuinely blew me away. The songs are catchy. I know it's a guilty pleasure, but I gotta give it to them. Diatribes, good album, so it's gonna go in the A tier. Now their 2nd album, Torn Apart. Alright, so this is going to go in the B tier. This is, I want to say, a continuation of Diatribes. It's a very solid album, Greed to Breathe is very similar sounding to Greed Killing, which is good, but also at the same time, like, not the most original. A lot of the songs on here are more or less the same on Diatribes. This is like the middle of their experimental period. The band wasn't doing the best financially, so they were trying to appeal to as many labels as they could, or as much as they could. It is pretty catchy. I do like the groove. I'm not gonna lie. I do like the groove mixed with a bit of the grind and the death metal. A lot of people, like I said, just like Diatribes, don't really like this album, but I do appreciate this album for what it is. And with that being said, we're going on to Tales from the Exit Wound. And this is their 7th album, I think. Yeah. 8th. I don't know. This is the album after Torn Apart. This is going to go into a D territory. It's a solid D. So this is the very tip end of their groove, like experimental radio label friendly era. There's plenty of groove on this album, but there is a hint of grind, like death grind in it, that's hinting that it's foreshadowing that it's going to head towards more of its grindcore roots. But other than that, like, a lot of the song, like this song, this album is very middle of the pack for me. It doesn't really do a whole lot. Like, a lot of the songs are very uninspired sounding, very samey, very formulaic. They really bled the whole groove thing dry at this point. And like I said, I don't think Napalm Death has a bad album whatsoever. I think they have the most solid discography in a lot of metal bands, but this album personally doesn't really do a whole lot for me, so it's going to remain the D category. So with that being said, this is going to be quite a surprise, in my opinion. So this is in 2000, this is Napalm Death's 9th record, I believe. It's called Enemy of the Music Business. This is a full reform, like continued to their roots, full-on grindcore. And a lot of their anger, or a lot of the lyrical inspirations in the songs were inspired by their issues with Earache Records, and this was kind of a fuck you to Earache Records, and this is a full-blown fuck you. We're not trend seeking anymore. We're going full-blown grindcore. This is what we're meant to do. So the reason why I put it in C tier was, although this was return to formula, this album really just didn't blow me away in any way. Like, I respect it because it's returned to their more grindcore sound. But other than that, the songs really don't stand out to me. It's good, but it's not like, it doesn't blow my socks off. So this is going to stand at a C tier. And this is... Okay, so Order of the Leech. This album is probably an A tier for me. This album, they really just like Utopia Banished and From Enslavement to Obliteration, they really got the grips of what Napalm Death was, and the albums, the songs on this album are just so heavy and extreme and amazing, and they're really catchy. And this was, like, I want to say, like, at this point, like the fourth or fifth wave of Napalm Death. Like, this was what we would associate with Napalm Death today. The songs are amazing on this album, and I think that's why they deserve to be in the A territory. Now, the album after this is The Code is Red, Long Live the Code. This is also probably gonna be, I want to say, in the B territory. Just as good as the last album. It's, I want to say, a sister album to Order of the Leech. Songs are super catchy. I love it. This is Napalm Death really discovered what really works, what really sells. Their sound is really extreme. I believe this is the last record with Jesse Pintado. At this point on, it was Barney Greenway, Mitch Harris, Shane Embry, and Danny Hara on drums. Barney Greenway faced a brief hiatus from Napalm Death, but rejoined in '97. But on this point on, it was Barney, Shane, Danny, and Mitch on guitars. And I think this record is really good. This is good old-fashioned Napalm Death. It's a very solid record. Now for their next album in 2006, Smear Campaign. Like I said from before, this is a really awesome record. It's, I want to say, like a part 3 from Order of the Leech. It's like The Code is Red is part 2 and Smear Campaign is part 3. Like, it's an incredible album. It's melodic, it's heavy, there's a lot of grind, there's a lot of blast beats. It's just, there's so much to unpack, and it's, I really like it for what it is. It's definitely a little bit different from their last record, but overall this is solid Napalm Death. So for the next record, Time Waits for No Slave. This is also in another A territory. This record kicks ass as well. A lot of Life and Limb, very catchy. Dictate, very catchy. This is a very solid record. That's the I know I say that a lot. This is a solid record. That's a solid record. It's just all the records about Napalm Death are very solid. So this record I catch myself listening to a lot, and it's very heavy, and that's all I have to say. Utilitarian, gonna be honest, it didn't really blow me away. It's, at this point, like, these 4 is like, that's core Napalm Death, really, from the current lineup. Like, core current lineup is like right here. Like, these are like the good records. But this Utilitarian, it didn't really do much for me. There's a certain track that features a saxophone part, which I know it didn't really do much for me. It just fell out of place, and the songs were good, but at the same time, I think at this, like, the style's kind of getting old at this point, because it's just the same thing this album did, which is the same thing this album did, but this, it's just, it's good. Didn't blow me away, just like this whole record. Like, they're good. Harmony, Enemy, Utilitarian, they're all good. Didn't blow me away. Apex Predator is a decent record. It's a solid record. Not my favorite, but it's a very, very good record. But just like Utilitarian didn't really blow me away, it's very much a continuation of the sound of Utilitarian. And at this point, like, it's 8 albums of the same, or 6 albums of the same thing. Doesn't really blow me away. And now the last one, Throws in the Jaws of Defeatism, I think it is. This one is a D, and that's just simply because, like I said, Order the Leech, Code is Red, Time Waits for No Slave, Smear Campaign, those are all really great records, but Apex, Utilitarian, Apex, that's when it really got stale for me, and their current record, which I do believe is good musically, it's just stale. They really, really need to change up their sound. I appreciate their aggressiveness, but at this point it's not really jumping out at me. So yeah, so this is my ranking of all, what is it, 15, 16 Napalm Death records. And yeah, feel free to disagree.